Hi, I'm David Debato, and this is the No Delusion Zone with no AI either. Today, my very special guest is Jason Smart. Jason is one of the most sought after geopolitical analysts anywhere, especially when it comes to discussing either the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation, and of course, the ongoing catastrophe in Ukraine. He speaks fluent Russian. He has a PhD in Russian studies. And in fact, because of his honest and in depth reporting of Putin's Russia, he was declared persona non grata in Russia. An honorific that I am working towards myself, and someday I hope that I might achieve that also. But without further ado, Jason, welcome back to the No Delusion Zone.
It's great to see you, David.
Well, obviously, there's a lot to talk about. As I said off air, we're going to come back to the what's on everybody's minds, which is the summit tomorrow between Trump and Putin in Alaska. But before we get to that, there's a lot going on without that particular story in terms of Ukraine, NATO, the EU, and so forth. Could you briefly? Well, let me just throw this out here because I have to say this every time I talk about the war in Ukraine. Russia's not winning the war. Russia is not winning the ground war militarily. They're getting their ass handed to them. So if you could, in your own words, which are far more polite and professional than mine, could you give us a summary of what you see as the military situation in Iraq? Iraq. See, my mind's going to the Middle East in the Ukraine right now in terms of the Russian military offensive.
So we have to understand that the Russians have made some progress in the last couple of days in Donetsk. They moved about 18 kilometers, 12 miles inwards. Now, what's interesting about that is that it's come at a tremendous cost. I mean, it's come at just an absolutely phenomenal cost to the Russians. And it's not something that's sustainable. It seems that they want to have short-term gains because they realize that peace talks are starting. So they're trying to grab up some land. Now, the Ukrainians simultaneously are launching large-scale attacks across Russia. In fact, just if you look at the oil industry that's been attacked recently, it's about 17% of all their oil refining capacity has been affected. More than that, if you look at the attack just earlier today by Ukrainian drones on the Southern Military Command, which is the Russian military command post that handles all of the occupied territories, the current war in Ukraine as a whole. So they were able to successfully, carry out attacks across Russia, across multiple facilities, and also in the Oblast of Bryansk, also in Belgorod, downtown Belgorod, even the administrative center was attacked. So Ukraine is doing something different. Ukraine's strategy here is not to fight a war of attrition, as would be favorable to the Russians, given their larger size, but to instead fight a war that's more strategic, to make it impossible for the Russians to physically wage war by attacking things like the oil industry, which gives Russia the hard currency it needs to continue fighting the war. And in fact, I mean, more than 20% of seaborne oil for the Russians has been affected by the recent Ukrainian attacks. So overall, Ukraine is just fighting, let's say, smarter. It's not fighting for every centimeter of land because it realizes it will get it back. But the first step to get it back is to cause Russia to be unable to continue waging war, which I think every day is getting a little bit closer.
Yeah, let's follow up on that. And again, I am so frustrated with the Western press, not just in the United States, Europe. They're not hammering home what you just said. They don't talk as much as they should about the Ukrainian successes, especially in their drone warfare against Russia. What would you say the success? Well, what are some of the biggest successes of the drone attacks in Russia? You mentioned a few of them, but they've been really hammering their logistical centers and refineries and oil distribution centers. What's some of the effects that's currently having on the Russian ability to wage war in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, if you look at the attacks, for instance, on the recent ones that were carried out in Volgograd, that was a facility that created a lot of the fuel for avionics specifically. So this means that the Russian aviation industry is affected. We also saw an attack in Sochi, the facility there that stored all of the aviation fuel. So within Russia, aviation fuel is becoming harder to come by. But there's another aspect of this as well, which is that diesel itself has gone up dramatically in price. In fact, it costs more now in Russia than in the United States. The result of that is that a lot of the trains that Russia uses actually are reliant still on diesel. And what's interesting is that more than 70% of military transport is done by train, which now it's become just an unbearable cost. And within Russia itself, there's been a huge decline in the amount of transport in the past year, 2 years, of just goods as a whole for the Russian rail industry. Why that matters is that at this point, it's untenable. They can't afford to continue subsidizing this. In fact, Russian railroad workers were recently informed that they should take 2 days off a month without pay because the government just can't afford to pay them. And so that's amazing. 70% of military transport's using these trains, and the Russian government cannot keep it going. And this is partially due to the fact that Ukraine has successfully attacked things like the refineries where they produce the diesel. So by carrying out these attacks, Ukraine is making it harder and harder for Russia to wage war. And I think this is something that we're going to see more of, not less of. It's just going to be increasing. And it does reach an actual break-even point or a critical point where the Russians are not able to continue the war without making more significant cuts. Currently, about 40% of their federal budget goes to the war or to the Ministry of Defense. And that's a huge amount. But if they get more cuts, if they take more hits on their oil industry and their gas industry, or if more secondary sanctions come into effect that would affect the Chinese and the Indians from buying the oil, which combined they are about 75% of the oil purchased from Russia, of which the federal budget is about 45% from oil and gas. Let's imagine that that gets either attacked by the Ukrainians, the oil and gas industry, or the Indians and Chinese buy less. The Russian economy can't sustain it. There's no way for the government to continue fighting this war. In fact, it looks like this year they're going to devalue the ruble. It's currently about 100 to the dollar. It looks like they're going to have to devalue it about 50% or 25 to 75% is usually what they say. So let's say 50% devaluation. That's a huge amount. And the average Russian, about 82% of their income goes to food, utilities, rent. And so if you lose 50% of your income thereover due to devaluation, that's significant. It's very hard to survive. It's a very difficult situation in Russia, and it's just getting worse.
So, in terms of the Russian economy, is that because of the sanctions, or more about what you're talking about, the targeted attacks on their infrastructure by Ukraine, and the insane amount of GDP that's going towards the war effort by the Russian government, and the ripple effect it's had by their economy? Is it all of that, or are the sanctions having any effect, or is it those other two things, the amount spent on the war by the government and the attacks on their infrastructure that's really decimating the economy?
Well, it's definitely decimating the economy, and it is a combination of things. It's not just one or the other. The fact is that the Russian economy wasn't really doing great before the war started, but now, due to the fact that there's less people buying Russian oil, less people buying Russian gas, and also the price just has gone down of Urals crude, the type of oil they get from Russia. It's in fact about 30% less than what is needed to have a balanced budget in Russia. Because they calculate it assuming a certain cost, and if it's less than that, that it really affects everything. So the Russians are having significant problems trying to balance their budget, to try to make their economy work. And it's so significant that we see regions around Russia are going to Moscow asking for money because they're defaulting. And in fact, the government itself has caused a number of different businesses, specifically in the defense industry, to default, or to, I should say, to go bankrupt because they simply didn't pay them, which is amazing that the Russian government's not paying like defense contractors. But this is indicative of what we see across Russia as a whole. I mean, there's significantly bad economic data from Russia. I mean, inflation, according to their central banks, about 9.5%. The central bank has just lowered the key interest rate. It's about, I can't remember, 19%, I want to say, which is lower, 19%. That's just killing the industry. It's killing, you can't get loans for anything. The Russian economy has significant problems. I mean, we look at the amount of liquidity in the banks. There's significant liquidity problems with the Russian banks, affecting a huge percentage of the banking pool. And they are on the bridge of having, it looks like in the very near term, a significant downturn that'll be far worse than what 2008 was in the United States. It has a lot of the same things, like loans that have gone toxic and things like this, but it's actually much worse in Russia because unlike the United States, where there's always a market for the U.S. dollar, plus the fact that the United States is not sanctioned, it was able to get itself out, but it's very expensive. The Russians have no capacity to do so. And that's why I think that in the very near term, we could see, significant problems within Russia leading to unrest. I mean, it's really a bad situation economically.
It's really kind of funny. I think right now, what you're talking about is, the economic numbers, the situation in Russia in terms of economics. We're we have to believe the government numbers. And believe it or not, Jason, there are some countries which are actually doctoring their own economic, outlook. I can think of one right here, right now, that we can't trust it anymore. They've fired people that talk about the economic situation. But in Russia, you mentioned that they lowered the interest rate. I think it is at 19% right now. And from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that is because the number of Russian businesses that are going bankrupt and can't afford to operate at such high interest rates has had a ripple effect. People can't get mortgages. Construction companies can't build new houses or apartments or businesses, which of course ripples down through the economy. So the fact that they've lowered the central bank has lowered the interest rate is not necessarily a good sign, is it?
No, it's not, and they probably should not have done it. The reality is, I mean, others like Steve, come to my name in a second, a professor at John Hopkins University estimates that the real Steve Hanke, he estimates that the real level of inflation within Russia is probably closer to 27%. So when they're lowering the key interest rate, that's just going to make inflation worse. So you might wonder, like, why would they do it then? And that shows you just sort of the bad planning of the government is that it was due to political will. It was due to the fact that Putin said, lower the interest rates to show that things are getting better. So they do so. But that's only going to make the general situation within Russia worse. I mean, in fact, 1 in 2 Russians is looking for part-time work right now. This shows you how the economy is doing. They have an unemployment rate that's extremely low. I mean, it's only a few percentage points, which is actually highly indicative of inflation. When you have a very, very, very low unemployment rate, it means there's usually very high inflation. In the case of Russia, though, it's just going to get worse. There's no reason to think it's going to get better. And especially if there's less purchase of things like oil and gas, that means there's less hard currency. Less hard currency will also, work its magic on the Russian economy.
And isn't it a fact that in Russia, a lot of the good new jobs, especially for young men, is in the defense sector? And once that falls apart, which it will, that's going to have an even more devastating effect on the economy.
Undoubtedly the case. And in fact, that's an entire interesting point is that one of the reasons that Putin wishes to continue the war, many people argue, is because he's worried about that. I mean, what do you do if the war ends and what do you do with all these people now? There's not jobs for them. There's nothing to do. More than that, I mean, does he really want to have, hundreds of thousands of guys who just came from Ukraine, who are these angry veterans who are no longer get the benefits they have been receiving? They're no longer get all these great things that they thought were going to last forever because the Russian government won't be able to afford it anymore. So then he'll have the potential for civil unrest, which is something that, dictatorships generally fear. So I think the situation for Vladimir Putin and his regime just becomes more complicated by the day.
Well, just as a side note, before I go into another topic, you mentioned the angry veterans coming home. That's an undercurrent that's growing right now, and I'm sure you're aware of that, are the thousands of angry veterans with disabilities, with PTSD, many of which were released from prison before they went to Ukraine, some of them with very violent criminal records. They are now wreaking havoc, a lot of them, in their towns and cities where they've been released. I'm talking about committing more crimes, violent crimes, and that's becoming a bigger and bigger problem and will continue to be a bigger problem as more of these angry, disgruntled veterans come back to their hometowns.
I mean, it is daily that there's something just horrific occurring with the veterans from Russia, because you're right, they did a lot of people who had been locked up for including violent crimes. They've let out, murderers, rapists, things like this, and they were in the Russian military for their length of time, and now they're free, and they've gone back to being murderers and rapists. And so it's become a very dangerous place in some parts of Russia due to the fact that these veterans come back, they've been in the war, it's got its trauma associated with it, but they have no actual useful skills because they've always been, locked up. So now they have been turned on to the economy, turned on to the people, and it doesn't work out very well for the local population.
Well, it doesn't help that before this even happened, that Russia decriminalized most of the domestic violence laws where a man can actually legally beat his wife half to death without fear of arrest. But that's another issue. Not a good one, but another issue. You've written and made some podcasts recently about the fear that is currently circulating in the Kremlin and the fact that the oligarchs, the elites, they're circling. The sharks are circling the tank waiting to see what happens and actually trying to take one another out. Can you talk about that, the undercurrent of what's going on right now with the folks that do have money and power, and they can see that change may be coming, and they're trying to leverage their positions. And like I said, I know you've written and talked about that. If you can go into that a little bit right now.
Sure. So one of the things that we have to understand is that within Russia, there's various oligarchical classes. Currently, they're not really at war with each other like they were in the 1990s, which is why Russia was so tumultuous and violent. It's something actually that Vladimir Putin was able to put some order in. Due to Vladimir Putin, the oligarchs stopped, trying to kill each other and to not really cooperate, but I'd say just to behave civilly. Because the head of the mafia was no longer any of them, but it was rather Putin himself. He's the center of all the criminal organization of Russia. Now, these different groups don't get along with each other. They don't like each other. They're in conflict with each other. Some of them have their own private military companies. And they're all cognizant of the fact that, one day Vladimir Putin will die from one thing or another, or this war could go badly and Russia collapses. And they realize that at that point, Vladimir Putin will no longer be there to protect them, no longer able to save them. And if that were to happen, what does that mean? Well, in real terms, it means that if you are from one of the minority factions, you're one of the factions that would not be able to survive post-Putin, you're going to be liquidated because that's just what happens. So they're going to kill you, kill your family, take your assets. And the oligarchs will fight with each other, and eventually it'll just rise up to who replaces Putin. But where it gets sort of interesting in this specific case is that if you think about this like game theory, it's sort of unwise to sit around and just wait for Putin to die. You should look for the opportunity to make sure that your faction, if it's the weaker one, is able to take the power to prevent some other faction from coming to power. And thus that helps your own self-preservation. And if you're looking at a situation in Russia, it's something they should be worried about. And if you look at the recent arrests that have occurred of people from the oligarchical class, as well as regional governors, as well as military officers, there's something definitely cooking inside of Russia. We don't know all the details, but we can see a lot of the smoke, let's say. So we know there's fire. And where that points us to in general, I think most people would agree, is the fact that Russia now is running out of money. So the FSB, which is their intelligence service, is just a criminal organization. And if you really want to understand it, its primary objective is to make money. And it operates just like a mafia. I mean, it runs extortion schemes, it runs racketeering, it sells illegally oil internationally, which is part of the reason that oil executives go out of windows all the time. But either way, if you're looking at this and you realize there's less assets, there's less money to divide up, they need more. And because they need more is why they started arresting people. It's because they need to take assets from them. But it's a very bad sign because now it's starting to cannibalize itself. The system itself is cannibalizing. And people that are even loyal to the system from within the system are now also being arrested. And that's a big deal because before there was protection. And if you worked with Putin, you're part of Team Putin, that gave you the protection you needed. You would be sure that nothing's going to happen to you. But now it's no longer enough. I mean, it's nice, that's great. But at the end of the day, if I have to choose between, my future or getting money, I should say, to replace the money that we're no longer getting due to this war, well, they're going to come shake you down for it. Or they'll throw you in prison to take that money. And that's going to create more and more conflict as it goes on, especially when you get to the higher and higher valued people. For instance, those who are specifically the ones that have large amount of resources and private military companies. Because when you start fighting with people that have private military companies, they can really fight back effectively. And that leads to a very high potential for a destabilization within Russia itself.
You talked about a purge, and you've kind of danced around it with what you're just talking about. You did a podcast about it. Are we witnessing the beginning of a purge in Russia?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's fair to say that it's starting. I mean, how it works out is very hard to describe, but it's hard to be certain of because it could go any direction, right? But at the same time, I think that it's definitely starting. I mean, within the FSB itself, there's 3 different major factions. They don't really get along with each other. And actually, I'm probably going to do a podcast about that soon because that's a whole different issue.
Well, you know what? Talk about it. We have a few minutes. What are the 3 different factions? Just briefly.
So the 3 different factions, it's actually personality based. And you have to understand when I say personality based, it's not really about like the person himself. It's simply that they have different, what do we call it, fiefdoms, I guess, where they have different things that they're in charge of. Different things like the oil industry, for instance, some of them take care of. Others are in charge of doing things like crypto and dealing with things like computer crime and racketeering. But anyways, it's all divided and subdivided. But all of them have a mission to eventually pass and become the leader of Russia after Putin. as do people from within the military. Now, the military, I think, has been cut off quite a bit, especially after the failures in the beginning of the war. They've lost a lot of credibility within the Kremlin court, and so they are, I think, in a diminished position. But those from the intelligence service, they're at the very top. And because they are at the very top and increasingly trusted by Putin. I mean, Putin himself, you remember when Kursk, Russia, was under Ukrainian occupation, the military was unable to get rid of them. And in fact, they were given deadlines multiple times by Putin, which they kept missing because they were not able to get rid of them. Now, why I mention all this, I think is very interesting, is that Putin then trusted the FSB. He turned over the throwing the Ukrainians out to the FSB, not to the military. And that itself is sort of fascinating because it shows how much he doesn't really respect the military. He doesn't really care about them. You have a Ministry of Defense and your country's being invaded and you can't count on them. What does that say? So I think going ahead, it's going to be interesting to see how it all does play out. But I think that things are getting far, far more dangerous. I would say skating on thin ice for the Putin regime. Any day, something radical could happen. And it wouldn't be hard. I mean, right now, for Putin to hypothetically travel to the U.S., it would be a huge risk just because anytime you leave the country, there's a chance that somebody's going to make it, it's very easy to target airplanes, but also within Moscow, somebody else could try to seize power anytime. So it's a very high risk proposition for him to leave Russia.
Didn't he just arrest I think it was the governor of the Kursk Oblast?
He arrested Kursk. He also arrested Belgorod. They arrested
Yeah.
some others as well. I'd have to actually check the names of all of them. But I think that what the thing is that they would say, if you look at them as a whole and say, okay, what does it all mean? Why are they getting arrested? So in the case of the ones on the border, is actually Belgorod is the one I think you're referencing. It was sort of interesting. It's because I'll give you two-step stories. Okay, you remember that there was the Minister of Transport who apparently, allegedly, killed himself a couple weeks ago, and within hours he was fired by Putin from being Minister of Transport. And there's something really fascinating about that. So apparently he was under investigation for having embezzled $246 million that is meant for the defense of that region, which borders Ukraine, to prevent invasion. Sorry. It appears that he probably did embezzle that money. But of course, when you're embezzling that sort of money, you're not doing it by yourself. You're working with others, like those in the military, which is probably part of the reason they got killed. But there's an additional part of this, which is that as a Minister of Transport, he was also in charge of all the ports in the country. And today we see that the FSB, it was within like 2 weeks of him dying, the FSB has taken over the ports in Russia. So what does that mean? What should we deduce? Well, it's because there's less and less resources inside of Russia. And the FSB also wants to have an access to everything that comes in and goes out of the country, which then allows them to take a percentage off of it. Because ultimately, as I said, it's just a criminal enterprise. It's a mafia.
I agree with you. I think this is the beginning of a purge. Look, these are sharks. These are criminals, just like Putin. He's the mob boss. He's the Don. But these are all his apprentices. Not to steal a term from Trump here, but they're just circling the tank, waiting for their time to jump in. Because look, Putin is 72, and I don't believe he's in anywhere near as good a physical and medical shape as they say. The war will come to an end, whether it's a disaster on Russia's part or not. It's going to stop, and one of them are going to have to take over. So they're trying to leverage their power right now and see what happens. Last thing before we go to the Alaska summit tomorrow, with all of the successful drone attacks that are happening all over Russia, literally from Siberia to the Moscow region to the Ukrainian border, and I'm sure all of your viewers have seen the videos on YouTube and elsewhere of the explosions, the successful attacks on these refineries and rail stations and so forth. And many of them, of course, or most of them, are made by Russian civilians. I personally don't believe that that's going to have any effect on the Russian population at large in terms of turning against Putin because of the obvious police state. Sure, it's damaged his credibility for saying that he's going to protect Mother Russia from attacks by Ukraine, and he's obviously failed miserably. But I do not believe that's going to do anything. It's not going to start any kind of a sizable uprising against Putin. Your thoughts?
No, there won't be any uprising. I don't think that there's going to be an uprising really ever in Russia, like a Red Revolution sort. What's much more probable is there'll just be an overthrow of the regime. So when you look at the history of personality-based regimes, dictatorships, the most common way that they end is not by, people rising up. It's usually from within the court itself. Somebody just offs the leader, or the leader just dies. Are the most common reasons that these things end. And for Vladimir Putin, it's probably going to go the same way. I mean, and it's not really what the common person thinks that matters. I don't think anyone really cares what the common Russian thinks. It's really why that would matter at all is because if you're trying to overthrow power, you want to make sure that you are not going to be overthrown yourself. And one way to gauge that is to see if the population loves the current leader. Now, if we look at what happened in Rostov back in 2024, when 2023, sorry, when Prigozhin made his move there and he led the Wagner uprising, what was interesting was that the local Russian population was very positive to him. I mean, they came out and they greeted him in the streets. They brought him food, they brought him wine. The people were excited to see him. And that's probably a very bad sign if you're Putin, because this guy was leading an armed insurrection, and the people of Russia were very supportive.
I agree. I agree. Well, we have to get to the Alaska summit. I watched some of your recent podcasts about that, and I've talked to you about it before. And you talked, well, let me just say before we even get into it that, as usual, I'm very disgusted with the Western press, all of it, for the most part. Not the individual independent podcast, but the mainstream press and their coverage of this. They're covering this as if these are two standard historical, intelligent and competent leaders of democracies, and they're going there to have an honest dialogue on trying to solve one of the world's biggest conflicts. What a load of BS. I mean, very few, except on venues like this, are calling it for what it is, which is bullshit. You use the term influence operation. As everyone knows, I think, with half a brain, Putin was a KGB officer. He's not a dummy when it comes to influence operations or working assets. You've talked a lot about it. Let's get into it right now. What should we expect from Putin at the Alaska meeting with Donald Trump?
So I think Vladimir Putin is entering this with the intention of doing a couple things. One is he understands that very well. His objective should be to influence Donald Trump, to get Donald Trump on their side, to understand that, per the perspective of Putin, that is in fact, the Russians who want to make peace, and it's not the Ukrainians, to put the Ukrainians into a bad position. But Vladimir Putin himself is pretty good at reading people. And that's one of his skills that he really does have, and it's something he takes a lot of pride in. He always says that he's a specialist in human relations, which means manipulation. And it's actually one of the arguments they make for why, one of the reasons he invaded Ukraine, he just got so wrong. He totally expected this to be just a few days. Now it's 3.5 years, is simply that he totally went into lockdown during COVID and he didn't leave. I mean, he stayed there for years. And because he was not meeting with people, I mean, to meet with him, you had to stay in full quarantine for at least 2 weeks. So there was not many people coming to see him. Now, why I mention all this? Because a key part of reading people is to see the way that they gesticulate with their hands, the way they speak, if they show nervousness. But he didn't see any of that because he was communicating with people only by phone. And so he was missing a lot of being able to read people, which is, I think, an element of why he was just getting things wrong. But going to this meeting, I think he will definitely try to manipulate Donald Trump. And unfortunately, I think it's not going to be that difficult, just given the fact that, the ego of the American leader is quite, quite large. And anyone knows that's always an easy target. Just go for pride. Pride is always the way you attack, because it's something that they'll probably, be open to. And I think that Vladimir Putin praising Donald Trump or trying to make him feel that they're on the same team, it will not be hard. I mean, Donald Trump already has some sort of a strange interest and liking for Vladimir Putin. So I think that he will look forward to this meeting. What happens next is hard to say, but I think that it is a little bit alarming that the Russian leader is so adept at trying to understand his circumstances versus the American leader, who I think he's pretty clueless to what's going on usually.
Well, I've said this, I've written this, and I've made a podcast about it. We've already lost. When I say we, the West, by the fact that Putin is allowed to come on U.S. soil at all, period. He's an indicted war criminal. He shouldn't be allowed here other than to be placed in handcuffs and taken into custody by either the U.S. Marshals or the FBI. But that's, of course, not going to happen. So the fact that he's been invited here, that he's being welcomed at an American military base, Elmansdorf, I understand now, with his top advisors, including Lavrov and some other criminals, is a slap in the face. So we've already lost that part of it. The diplomatic and strategic part of this. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, Trump is ripe for manipulating. Personally, and please give me your thoughts or disagree with me if you would. I think that Trump's already made up his mind. He's already told his people like Rubio what he wants to do. Of course, that could change any moment, but for the most part, I think he's signaled what he wants to do. I know that Putin has told Witkoff and Rubio before that what their demands are, what their red lines are, and that was brought back to Trump. I really am, how can I say? I'm not afraid. I'm almost certain that Trump's going to sell out Ukraine. He's not going to. He may even. He very well may lift the sanctions, or at least many of them. He's not going to enforce any of the demands of Ukraine. He's certainly going to tell Putin that Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, and he may even promise not to support Ukraine militarily. I just believe that he's going to throw them under the bus. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. What do you think?
I think it depends on a few things. I don't think it will be that bad. And the reason is very simple is because I believe that Donald Trump is an egomaniac. And because of that, I think it's actually favorable to Ukraine in this situation. And the reason is just because of this, is because if he were to, let's hypothetically, right, one, in these sorts of meetings, they're not going to actually agree on anything tomorrow. So that's like just fundamentally not the way the meetings work, right? They're supposed to both go there, and it's more about chatting. There's not going to be a lot of solid outcomes. But let's just imagine that. But they sat there and they made a deal. Okay, and keep all the occupied territories. But what does that really help Donald Trump if the reaction in the United States is highly negative, which, by the way, polling shows that would be very negative, including amongst Republicans. It would be extremely negative with the Europeans as well as with the Ukrainians, obviously. And everybody complaining all at once doesn't help Donald Trump. I think that Donald Trump will do whatever he thinks is best for him. And for his own popularity, which has taken a hit, keep in mind, he was more than 30% of MAGA Republicans say they do not support the way that he's been managing things as of recent. He's taken a huge hit to his base. And actually, Ukraine is surprisingly one of the more positive issues he can do because it shows that he's a strong leader against Putin. And just because of that, I think is enough to motivate him to not totally fold to Putin. I mean, I think that he, once again, I think he has a very unusual and unhealthy interest in Putin. But that being said, I don't think that he would sacrifice his own ego and his own arrogance for that of Putin's. I think he'll do whatever helps out Donald Trump the best.
Boy, I hope you're right, Jason. But, whenever he gets in a room with Putin, he gets hypnotized. His eyes glaze over, and whatever you or I or anyone else thought may happen or he might say seems to vanish into thin air. He just doesn't do very well in Putin's presence. And I know what you're saying, that it's not very popular with MAGA if he actually does the wrong thing with Ukraine. But look at the Jeffrey Epstein issue. That's the top of the agenda with MAGA. And they're really angry with him about that. But he's bucking them for maybe obvious reasons. Maybe he's involved. But there are certain things where he draws a line or he's just not able to from within his soul to change the way he is. And I'm sorry, I hope I'm wrong. I don't think he's going to do a very good job when he talks to Putin. I think he's going to acquiesce to a lot of what Putin wants.
Listen, I think that ultimately he's going to do what he thinks is going to be best for his ego. But at the same time, the Epstein case, you're absolutely right. It's really hurt his popularity with MAGA, which is another reason I don't think he's going to double down and do something that's going to make him even more unpopular. I don't see how that really helps him. I mean, I think that it just, how's it help him? I think he'll do whatever helps him. But there's another side to this as well, is, and it's funny. I was an hour ago on Ukrainian TV here. I was just on the TV station. And it's funny as they said, do you think he's really just motivated by, why does he care so much about Ukraine? I said, I don't think he does care so much about Ukraine. They said, but then why is he taking such an active role in this? Is it just to get a Nobel Peace Prize? And I said, yeah, actually, it's a safe bet. I think that's at least 80% of it right there. If it wasn't for that, he would never have cared at all. So I think like if you're Donald Trump, like that motivates him. That is a driving force in his life. It's that simple. And I think that, this TV show host, I think was shocked. But yeah, I mean, I think the guy is driven by his ego. I see no sign he's driven by anything else. We've seen even as a businessman, he was a terrible businessman. Why? He's driven by his ego, not driven by any even numbers.
Well, I agree with you. And, he's all about deals. I just wrote about that. I'm so sick of these deals. I hate the word deals. Territorial integrity is not a deal. Human rights are not a deal. Democracy is not made from a deal. But, it just gets me angry. Look, I hope he doesn't throw Ukraine under the bus. I hope he doesn't just say yes to everything that Putin wants. But what you just said, I think, is perhaps the most likely outcome, that he gets so disgusted with Putin that he just says, I'm going to walk away. And even though that would be very, very bad for Ukraine, it would not be the worst possible outcome because NATO and the EU are stepping forward. It would be much, much worse if he threw in with Putin and gave him everything he wanted. So let me follow up on that with you. If it turns out that Trump just gets, his ego's hurt and he's angry at Putin and he just says, okay, you two, deal with this, meaning Putin and Zelensky, what do you think the reaction would be, number one, of Putin and also then of Europe, NATO, and the EU if America under Trump just walks away?
Well, I mean, it's going to be hard for the Americans just to walk away for a few reasons. One is simply because it's not just because of national security concern. It's also, at this point, because Donald Trump has changed it, where they're buying the weapons from America. It's just financially beneficial for the American government to continue allowing the sale of weapons. Why would they not want that? That creates jobs, that creates tax revenue. There's no loss on that. It also further integrates a European country into having U.S.-made weapons instead of European-made weapons.
But Jason, that was the case before, and his ego wouldn't let him do it, and he wanted to, and he did stop the weapons systems going to Ukraine, although they were already previously bought. But when it was brought up that they give America jobs, it took a while for him to still come about and say, then maybe that's true.
But the latest weapons that they're getting is because the Europeans themselves pay for it.
Yes.
And so that's,
Understood.
like, why would you stop that? Like, okay, if Germany wants to buy weapons, go for it. What you do with them is up to you, but we'll sell you the weapons. So I think that's one aspect of it. Now, there's another aspect of this as well, which is the fact that I think that, and this is actually probably one of the most interesting angles that nobody's looking at, which is, I think, the most interesting thing going on in the war right now, which is totally never mentioned by anyone, is the fact that look what India and China are doing specifically with the U.S. right now in their negotiations about tariffs. So there's a lot going on about that right now. And, Beijing, that is to say China, has been meeting a lot with the Americans. I think it was in Stockholm. They just wrapped up another series of negotiations, and they're continuing more. But anyways, all these different sanctions are going, all these different conversations about sanctions, or these tariffs, I should say, is ongoing. And what's so interesting is that if I was China, or if I was India, and I realize, about 15% of my trade, 15% of my trade is with the U.S. versus less than 3% with Russia, I would be much more interested in making sure I don't get the tariffs from the U.S., which is why I think I would have a lot of leverage if I was negotiating with the Americans to say, look, we will stop buying the Russian oil, and so you won't have to put more tariffs on us. But in addition to that, we want you to lower the tariffs that you've already proposed on us, aside from Russia, the current tariffs that he's just put on all the countries. And that actually is huge, because if you look about India and China historically, I see no reason to believe whatsoever that they would not put their own economic interest ahead of Russia's. And they would save a lot of money, lots more money, just simply not buying from Russia than to continue buying from Russia. So if they can be forced out of buying from Russia, which is I think actually where we're going right now, I think that is actually the stick that is about to be used if Russians don't cooperate, is to simply just give a better deal to the Chinese and the Indians and say, listen, we're going to not put on such a high tariff on your goods to come to the U.S., which will allow your economy to flourish. If you don't do this, though, your economy will crash. It will be disastrous for their economies. So I think they'll go along with that. And Putin will just be left there totally screwed. Totally naked. There's nothing he can do at that point, and his national economy will collapse. It'll be the end of the Russian economy. Now, on the other side, what I think is a very likely outcome, if I had to guess a negative likely outcome, I'm beyond certain is that Vladimir Putin, one of the first things he'll say, it won't even be to recognize territory or something like this, because he knows that's not going to happen that day. But he can ask to take sanctions off of some Russian businesses or some people in Russia. And I'm sure that's something he's going to request and say, listen, I need some breathing space to make these negotiations. Can you lessen the sanctions? Now, the bad side about that is obviously because one, Russia's economy is just a disaster. The more we keep them on, the faster it falls apart. But two, is that that would buy Putin enough time to keep fighting this war, to get more territory occupied. But if, let's imagine Trump does not agree to with that, he does not agree to lower the sanctions, Russia is in a really difficult position. I mean, their economy is falling apart. There's no one inside of Russia, no economist I could think of inside of Russia, who thinks that things are going well. I mean, the Minister of Economics, Brezhnev, he said that the country is entering into a recession. We saw the Minister of Finance at this point said that their economy is also a mess. The head of central banks, unfortunately, a very bright woman who's doing a good job to manage things in Russia, considering all that's going on. But she should be a saint in Russia because she's done more to get their economy to continue operating than anyone else there. But if things continue as they are right now, Russia really could have a terminal collapse of their banking system. I mean, it is a significantly bad position that Russia is in today. In fact, even think tanks connected to the Kremlin project that there could be what they call cascading collapse of Russian banks by next year.
Didn't India actually refuse to buy, and correct me if I'm wrong, either a large amount of Russian oil or buy it at a much reduced price because of American pressure?
So at the government level, they've stopped buying it, and they just got a 5% $5 discount per barrel. I just read earlier this week to continue buying it. What's interesting about the Indians actually is that they're buying it largely. The ones that are still buying it are not buying it for domestic usage. They're just working it and then they're selling it on the international market. So it's just purely profit. This is nothing even with about domestic needs or domestic concern. It's purely just making money. And so that's why I think that it's something that they'll be willing to part with is there's really no immediate negative effect for the Indian government to just sort of force that industry to stop buying the Russian oil. That being said, I think that in the case of both India and China, of course, they'll make a lot of statements between now and then saying that, we make our own decisions. Americans can't force us to do anything, which is what everybody always says. But at the end of the day, words are very cheap. Let's look at the actions. Are they willing to face, losing 12% of their exports? I doubt it. I really seriously doubt it. And so that's why I think that this could be the move that changes the war.
One last point before we go. We really haven't talked that much about NATO and the EU. They've made some interesting moves recently. Germany just opened up, was it $500 million? Well, I guess NATO as a whole, $500 million. The Netherlands themselves, I think, just approved sending, I think, $528 million worth of aid to Ukraine. Can you talk about the recent NATO push and their getting together, I guess, or getting it together to help Ukraine? And where do you see the European support going over the next 6 months till the end of the year?
Well, I think that the European support's very strong. And I think part of the reason that we probably saw this upsurge recently in Baltic states as well, a number of European countries, Western Europe, Central Europe, have been contributing to this assistance for Ukraine. Now, what's interesting is that I think all of them realize that these negotiations are starting, so it's very important to put Ukraine in a better position to show that, it's times on Ukraine's side. It's not like they can just, the Russians could wait out the Ukrainians. The Russians have to understand very well that Ukraine's getting all the support it needs, so they're not going to be in a better position if they just keep, fighting. It's only going to get worse for them. And I think that's part of the reason that right now we just saw this sudden upsurge. It's specifically to that. Now, long term, what does it mean? Overall, it seems that Zelensky's had very successful meetings with the Europeans in the past few weeks, including today. He's in the UK. But the meetings that he's been having, we see that there's a lot of very strong, not only public, but also government level support. They understand why this is so critical for the future security of Europe. And it's frankly much cheaper to help support Ukraine from afar than to fight the Russians yourself. That's going to be much more expensive. And so I think that for Ukraine, things are looking pretty good in Europe.
I agree. And now they just need to release that about $300 billion worth of frozen Russian bank assets, most of which is sitting in Belgium. But we're going to have to leave it there. Jason Smart, thank you again for joining me on the No Delusion Zone. We have to do it again soon. You take care of yourself, especially there in Kiev. Dodge those missiles.
Thank you. I appreciate it.